Okay, let's take a look at question 5 then. So, question 5, we have this STEM bit where it explains that a psychologist wants to have a look at whether audience has an effect on performance. It's all about shooting netballs for a hoop, participants taking 20 shots, and there's 2 different conditions, one with an audience, one without. And then let's have a look at the question. So the psychologist didn't know which experiment to do, and they're listed here: lab, natural, field, and quasi. So it says, referring to 2 or more, so I can refer to all 4 if I want, types of experiment, discuss what might be the most appropriate to use for the study and which might be the least. And it's 12 marks. So I know from this that there's description. So I'm going to talk about, I'd say 2 for this. Otherwise you're giving yourself a bit of too much work. So there's description. When I'm looking at the appropriateness, that's evaluation. And it's for this study, so there's application as well. So I've already broken it down. This is what it's looking at. And I'm looking for 2. So I could draw this as a table. I'm looking for description, evaluation, application for my 2 different types. And it's looking for which one's most appropriate, which one's least appropriate. Now actually for this experiment, lab would be the most appropriate because I can control everything. Least appropriate would be quasi. Now if you look here, I've got 6 boxes and 12 marks. So I just have to do 2 things, or 2 marks worth of stuff for each one in order to do it. So I could describe my lab experiment. And for a lab, I could talk about how it's controlled. So it's in a controlled environment, and they're randomly allocated to conditions. A description for quasi, that could be in lab or natural, and the IV is naturally occurring. That's my description marks done for those 2 different types of experiment. Now I am going to argue that lab is the best experiment for this. Okay, I've talked about control, so if I'm controlling it, it's going to make my study easy to repeat. So replication is able to happen, and it's going to be more reliable. So I can talk about reliability there. I can also I could maybe talk about however in this one, because that's me discussing, but that's going to be my main thing here for my evaluation. That's easy to control, so that allows replication to happen. Put that in, and it's going to be more reliable. If I'm arguing against using a quasi, then I'm going to use disadvantage. So my first disadvantage is that it's got to be naturally occurring. And for this study, that's going to be hard for me to do. I am going to have to try and find very specific conditions for this task. I have to find a netball team where they have no audience. I've got to find a netball team where they do have an audience, and I've got to try and get them to attempt to shoot 20 hoops naturally, without me taken part in it whatsoever. So that is not going to work in the slightest. And that can lead into another evaluation point that is just unrealistic to do. And once I've spent hours, days, weeks, months, years trying to find this 20 netball shoots with or without an audience happening, then it's going to be lacking mundane realism. It's going to be very unrealistic. My application, I'm actually going to say how I would do it. So in my lab, I would have to take my participants. I can still use a netball court, but the netball court is controlled. I would give them the full instructions on what they need to do. I would split them up into the two different groups using random allocation. That's what you need to talk about in your application, and a lot of people lost a lot of marks because they didn't apply. And this is literally asking you, okay, you're going to do it in a lab, how are you going to do it? If you were going to do it in terms of a quasi experiment, how would you do it? That's what this application is happening. So it's saying, for this study, how would you use a lab? For this study, how would you use a quasi? So that's what you talk about there. It's almost like you're designing the study. So actually you can see there's quite a lot of stuff for you to include. A lot of answers just superficially went over a little bit of this. To be honest, people got marks a little bit for the evaluation, but didn't for the description. You forgot to describe what a lab actually is, what a quasi actually is, or if you did field, or if you did natural. You forgot to describe why they are. Now these are just what we would argue in our department, that lab is most appropriate, quasi isn't. But if you went for a different one, that would be fine. As long as what you're saying is true and valid, then that would be alright. So if you decided the field was best and you could argue it why it was, then that would be a perfectly valid thing for you to talk about. But these were the two that we just thought were the best. So if you didn't get the best marks in this question, I'd really like you to have a go at planning it out, a bit like this that we've got here, but add your application in of saying, well, if it's a lab, this is what I would do. If it's a quasi, this is what I would do. And then maybe have a go at writing it again. But hopefully this has explained a bit more about what we're looking for this question.